Hello again, everybody. I bet you can't guess what I'm talking about this week, even if you've ignored the thumbnail. It is, of course, one of the Soviet-era 35mm film SLR cameras, and I've chosen it for a couple of reasons, really. It's the Zenith 3M. I bought this in about 1971 or 2. At a time when I was working for a black and white processing laboratory. I was sold this by a gentleman by the name of Chris Wilde, who is sadly no longer with us. Chris used to manage the photographic department of a chemist shop in my local town, and he knew that I worked at this processing laboratory, and I went in one day looking at this. The previous 35mm camera that I owned at the time was the Yashica Minster 3, which I've done a video on, and I'll put a link to that up there, or certainly in the notes down below. So Chris knew that I worked in this black and white processing laboratory, and he also knew that the photographers who went out doing photographs around the holiday camps in North Wales were all using Leica rangefinder cameras. Now, I did have this out with Chris a number of years later, but he sold me this, and what clinched the deal was the fact that he said, oh yeah, it takes Leica 39mm lenses. And instantly the gears started to whir in my brain, and I thought, fantastic, I can borrow some of the Leica lenses from work, save me a bob or two, and I've got an SLR into the bargain. You can probably tell where this is going. Of course, the Leica rangefinder camera lenses fitted mechanically perfectly onto this. This is a 39mm screw thread, but of course they wouldn't focus to infinity. Drat was one of the words that sprang to mind. The reason obviously is that with an SLR you've got a deeper film plane to lens flange distance than you have on a rangefinder camera, to take account of the mirror box. So although I had some fun doing close-up photography, none of the lovely Leica lenses would focus to infinity. So that's the reason why on the thumbnail I decided to ditch this camera really quite quickly, because even back in the early 70s it wasn't easy to get hold of 39mm. Lots of people referred to it as ZM39 lenses, Zenith 39mm screw-in lenses. They were really hard to come by even in those days, and try as I might, I couldn't find anything to fit on this. This isn't the exact camera, obviously, because I did sell it on. This one I have purchased very recently. It was advertised on a very well-known internet auction site for £30, including the lovely yak's hide leather ever-ready case that you got with all Soviet-era cameras. And I got it even cheaper than that because the shutter mechanism, it hangs on the 30th of a second setting, which is by no means unusual. These cameras were manufactured between 1962 and 1970, I think, somewhere in that, about an 8-year production run. And they produced, would you believe it, 780,000 of these. And this, of course, was the immediate predecessor to the Zenith B and Zenith E. And the Zenith E, I think I'm right in saying, is the most produced 35mm SLR camera in history. If anybody wants to disagree, please feel free. Let me know in the notes down below. Send me a comment. There was a slightly earlier version than the 3M, which was called the Zenit 3. Now the Zenit 3 retained the removable base plate loading mechanism, which up until that time had been found on this factory's Zorki cameras. Now, if you've loaded a Zorki or one of the period Leica rangefinder cameras, you'll realise it's fairly tricky to do. You have to take the base plate off, spool up your film, the film leader, insert both the film spool and canister in through the bottom of the camera, make sure it engages with the take-up spool. It's rather fiddly. So that was the same system employed on the Zenit 3. When they brought out the 3M, they quite wisely adopted a hinge back. I've got some stills to include in this hopefully quite short video because I don't want to try doing too many close-ups using the GoPro because it won't focus close enough. But yeah, on a 30th of a second this thing hangs, and when we say it hangs, I mean that the second shutter curtain actually sticks halfway across. But anyway, hinged back, so the loading is much easier. It is 99.5% metal construction. Everybody says, oh, it's all metal. That's not strictly speaking true, because the take-up spool is actually plastic. Okay, that's the only piece of plastic in this entire camera. Cloth focal plane shutter, very basic shutter. You've got speeds from a 500th of a second, 2/50th, 125, 60, 30 and B for bulb or timed exposure. Flash synchronization on all of these Soviet era SLRs is a 30th of a second, and if you're using either bulb or electronic flash, there is a lever underneath the shutter speed dial which you move from M for bulb photography, bulb flash photography, to X for electronic flash. Lever advance, you can inch that if you wish, just like on the Zenit B and E. The big difference is between this and a Zenith B or an E or any of the later cameras is that hopefully you might just be able to see the mirror inside the mirror box. As soon as you trip the shutter, the mirror flips up and it stays up. It's a non-instant return mirror, which means that as soon as you take the photograph with this camera, the viewfinder goes black. Not very convenient. That was another reason why I got rid of it fairly quickly, I'll be honest with you. Also, the viewfinder isn't exactly the brightest. I have got a photograph I can put up on screen for you to show you what it looks like. And probably worse than that, you've only got a ground glass focusing screen. There's no split image rangefinder, there's no microprism dots in there. It's really difficult to focus this camera. Quite how I managed it back in the day when my eyesight was no doubt a lot better. It amazes me, to be honest with you. It's 1966 vintage, by the way, this particular one. You can tell that. The serial number, which is stamped on the back of the top plate, the first two digits indicate the year of manufacture. It comes out of a factory by the name of KMZ in Moscow, and as I said earlier, they produce the Zorki cameras. So these SLRs are a development from the Zorki lineup. It has a self-timer, which I'm glad to say still works. It's quite noisy. Gives you round about 20 seconds, I would say, before the shutter trips. There we go, it's gone. It has a flash synchronization socket on the front plate. There is no hot shoe, you have a cold shoe on here, so any flash gun that you decide, if you want to use these cameras, you need to get one with a PC lead which connects to this socket on the front of the camera, otherwise your flash won't fire. The lens, this particular one is a 3.5 50mm Industar lens, which I think I'm right in saying is a 4-element design along the lines of a Tessar constructed lens. A lot of people refer to this lens as preset. It is not a preset lens, it is a manual lens. Preset lenses, and I'll put an image up on screen for you now, preset lenses all have two different aperture rings, one of which is click stopped and one of which is freely rotating. Now the idea is that when you make your or take your exposure meter reading, because all these cameras would have been intended to be used with a handheld meter like the Leningrad 4, I think I've got a photograph of one of those, you would take your exposure meter reading, decide on your shutter speed, match that to the recommended aperture. You would set the aperture on the front ring normally of the preset lens, the click stopped ring. So let's say it was reading 125th at f8, you would set the lens to f8. To make it easier to focus, you would then open the lens wide open using the second aperture ring, which is not click stopped. Focus on your subject, then turn that same ring back down as far as it would go, and it would preset to whatever the aperture had been set to, in this case f8. There's a clue in the name, preset, simple. This little Industar, on the other hand, is not even preset, it is a manual aperture lens. There is only one ring on it for setting your aperture. You just have to make the best of really a very basic job with this particular lens. Not a bad performer though, don't get me wrong. And it's very slim, you can tell. In modern parlance it would be called a pancake lens. Exposure index dial, frame counter, let's get it right. Your frame counter is a manual one, so you have to reset it every time you reload the camera with film. If you forget to do that, it's very easy to lose track of how many shots you've taken and how many you've got left on the roll. Because of course back in the days when this camera was available, you could get exposures as short as 12 and then 20, stroke 24 and 36. So depending on what you bought, you would have to remember really to reset this, because otherwise it's very easy with these Russian cameras. Another point that I want to make out to you, and I think I've done a close-up of this to illustrate the fact, the teeth on the take-up spool on very nearly every Soviet era camera, the teeth on these are really quite sharp, and unless you get the film aligned perfectly with these, it's very easy for the film to be ripped, for the perforations to be ripped. And if you're not careful, you can be merrily winding away thinking you're taking film, taking frames. In actual fact, the film isn't moving because it's been torn. So that's something to be aware of with more or less any of these Soviet era cameras. And the final thing that I think I want to point out is that the film speed index ring around the rewind crank, a rewind knob really, not a crank, the index might seem to be marked off in really quite odd numbers, and that's because it's indexed in the old Soviet era GOST rating, G-O-S-T, which I believe just stands simply for government standard. It's an arithmetic scale. It's similar to, but not identical to, the old ASA film speed rating. So there we are, Zenith 3M. The irony is that I bought this about 10 days ago. It's never going to get used by me. The days of me putting film through cameras has gone. That's a promise. The irony is, though, that no sooner had I got hold of this than I went online. Can you believe this? I went online and straight away started to look for micro 4/3 to Leica thread mount adapter so that I could put this lens on my micro 4/3 body. And if you haven't already worked it out, again, it wouldn't focus properly if I did go down that route. So I was kicking myself. You idiot. But I've got it, and I'm happy to put it on the shelf. It brings back some happy memories for me. The importers of these cameras back in the day was a company based in London called Technical and Optical Equipment, TOE, and they used to import big batches of these from USSR, and I believe that every one would have been checked by an engineer down at TOE before it was deemed good enough to send out to the retailers wherever they may be. So it had a really good distribution network. So there we are, little story about the Zenith 3M. It's going to live on a shelf, just bring back some happy memories. But if any of you are looking to purchase one of these, you're much better off looking for the later 42mm thread bodies, which are available. They did make them for the 3M, but because of the non-instant return mirror, I would recommend anybody looking for a Soviet era SLR camera to start off with a B or an E. And conversely, I would say avoid later Soviet era SLRs like the Zenith TTL, and I think the EM was another one, because they were produced sort of in the 80s when the country was going through a decline in terms of both finances and its manufacturing capabilities, and the quality of those isn't anything like as good as the B and the Zenith E. There we are. Hopefully a fairly short little video. Until the next time, when hopefully I will be giving you a pretty in-depth review of the Olympus 30mm 3.5 Olympus macro lens. Until the next time, I'm going to say, as per usual, enjoy your photography, stay safe everybody, and I'll see you very soon. Bye bye for now.